secretly ran a relatively small deficit, a step that would enable the world to adjust as we gradually got to where we needed to be. Carrying this plan out, our government could either auction bonus ICs every month or simply give them, say, to less developed countries needing to increase their exports. The latter course would deliver a form of foreign aid likely to be particularly effective and appreciated. I will close by reminding you again that I cried wolf once before. In general, the batting average of doomsayers in the U.S. is terrible. Our country has consistently made fools of those who were skeptical about either our economic potential or our resiliency. Many pessimistic seers simply underestimated the dynamism that has allowed us to overcome problems that once seemed ominous. We still have a truly remarkable country and economy. But I believe that in the trade deficit, we also have a problem that is going to test all of our abilities to find a solution. A gently declining dollar will not provide the answer. True, it would reduce our trade deficit to a degree, but not by enough to halt the outflow of our country's net worth and the resulting growth in our investment income deficit. Perhaps there are other solutions that make more sense than mine. However, wishful thinking and its usual companion, thumb-sucking, is not among them. From what I now see, action to halt the rapid outflow of our national wealth is called for, and ICs seem the least painful and most certain way to get the job done. Just keep remembering that this is not a small problem. For example, at the rate at which the rest of the world is now making net investments in the U.S., it could annually buy and sock away nearly 4% of our publicly traded stocks. In evaluating business options at Berkshire, my partner, Charles Munger, suggests that we pay close attention to his jocular wish. All I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there. Framers of our trade policy should heed this caution and steer clear of Squanderville.
Why Foreigners Can't Ditch Their Dollars. November 10, 2003. A sidebar by Warren Buffett with Carol Loomis.
How often have you seen a comment like this in articles about the U.S. dollar? Analysts say that what really worries them is that foreigners will start moving out of the dollar. Next time you see something like that, dismiss it. The fact is that foreigners, as a whole, cannot ditch their dollars. Indeed, because our trade deficit is constantly putting new dollars into the hands of foreigners, they have to just as constantly increase their U.S. investments. It's true, of course, that the rest of the world can choose which U.S. assets to hold. They can decide, for example, to sell U.S. bonds to buy U.S. stocks. Or they can move into real estate, as the Japanese did in the 1980s. Moreover, any of these moves, particularly if they are carried out by anxious sellers or buyers, can influence the price of the dollar. But imagine that the Japanese both want to get out of their U.S. real estate and entirely away from dollar assets. They can't accomplish that by selling their real estate to Americans because they will get paid in dollars. And if they sell their real estate to non-Americans, say the French, for euros, the property will remain in the hands of foreigners. In either kind of sale, the dollar assets held by the rest of the world will not, except for any concurrent shift in the price of the dollar, have changed. The bottom line is that other nations simply can't disinvest in the U.S. unless they, as a universe, buy more goods and services from us than we buy from them. That state of affairs would be called an American trade surplus, and we don't have one. You can dream up some radical plots for changing the situation. For example, the rest of the world could send the U.S. massive foreign aid that would serve to offset our trade deficit, but under any realistic view of things, our huge trade deficit guarantees that the rest of the world must not only hold the American assets it owns, but consistently add to them. And that's why, of course, our national net worth is gradually shifting away from our shores.
The Market According to Buffett, May 17, 2004, by David Stiers.
How much would you pay to get close to Warren Buffett? In what must set a new record for business fandom, some admirers were bidding as much as $117 on eBay for a ticket to Berkshire Hathaway's May 1st annual meeting. Determined to secure access for all, Buffett posted 10,000 tickets on the site at $2.50 apiece, a bargain given that one share of Class A stock goes for $93,500. But it's hardly the only time Buffett mania has reared its head. Below, a sampling of the robust Buffett aftermarket. $16.95, the best-selling Buffett tome. $210,000, Buffett's 20-year-old wallet sold at a charity auction in 1999. $5, 2 tickets to Berkshire Hathaway's annual meeting. $250,100, lunch with Buffett sold on eBay in 2003. $100, dollar bill signed by Buffett sold at a church auction in Nebraska in 2004. $20, bobblehead doll sold on the Omaha Royals website.
Editor's note: the eBay auction for a Buffett lunch to benefit San Francisco's Glide Foundation continues, and also jumps in price every year. In 2012, the winning bid, once again a record, was $3,456,789. The Best Advice I Ever Got, March 11, 2005. A Warren Buffett Recollection, edited by Carol Loomis. 3 times in the 2000s decade, Fortune lined up 20 or so well-known people and asked each to relate the best advice he or she had ever been given. Buffett agreed to be in the first of these packages, and within about 1 second of his acceptance, managing editor Rick Kirkland scheduled him for the cover. I had the Buffett interview assignment, and as I opened my notebook to record whatever he had to say, I was genuinely curious as to what it would be. I simply didn't think I'd ever heard him on this subject. So I said, "Okay, what is the best advice you ever got?" Back came an out-of-the-box answer that was a real doozy. He didn't have any best advice to talk about. Instead, he went on at length about the worst advice he had ever received, with it coming to boot from the 2 men he admired most. I can't remember how I presented Rick with this surprise twist on what he had in mind. Perhaps I have suppressed the whole scene from my brain, but you know what? We put Buffett on the cover anyway. CL.
I had 2 mentors, my dad, Howard Buffett, and Ben Graham. Here were these 2 guys who I revered and who over the years gave me tons of good advice. But when I think about what they said to me, the truth is, the first thing that comes to mind is bad advice. I was not quite 21 when this happened in 1951, and just getting out of business school at Columbia. I had just taken Ben's class there, and I was the most interested student you ever saw. I wanted to work for Ben at Graham Newman Corp., and I had famously gone to him and offered to work for nothing. He said no. But I still was determined to go into the securities business, and that's where Ben and my dad gave me the bad advice. They both thought it was a bad time to start. One thing on their minds was that the Dow Jones Industrials had been above 200 all year, and yet there had never been a year when it didn't sell below 200. So they both said, "You'll do fine, but this is not a good time to start." Now, there's one thing that may have influenced my dad, and maybe Ben too. I was too immature. I was not only young looking, I was young acting. I was skinny, my hair looked awful. Maybe their advice was their polite way of saying that before I started selling stocks, I needed to mature a little, or I wasn't going to be successful. But they didn't say that to me. They said the other. Anyway, I didn't pay any attention. I went back to Omaha and started selling securities at my dad's firm, Buffett Falk. My dad was a totally independent thinker. I suppose the fact that he was has influenced my own thinking some when it comes to buying stocks. Ben instructed me some there, too. He said, "You're neither right nor wrong because others agree with you. You're right because your facts and reasoning are right." Now, Ben, I started learning from him when I read his books on investing at the University of Nebraska. I had tried all kinds of investing up to then, but what he said, particularly in The Intelligent Investor, just lifted the scales from my eyes. Things like margin of safety and how to use Mr. Market rather than letting him use you. I then went to Columbia just to take his class, and later got that turned down when I asked him for a job. But I kept thinking about that idea when I came back to Omaha. I kept trying to sell Ben stocks and pestering him, sort of. And finally, one day in 1954, I got a letter from him saying something to the effect of, "The next time you're in New York, I'd like to talk to you about something." I was elated, and I made a point of getting to New York immediately. I went to work for Ben in August 1954 without ever having asked what my salary would be. It turned out to be $12,000, plus the next year I got a $2,000 bonus. I worked for both parts of the business. Graham Newman was a regulated investment company, and Newman and Graham Limited was what we'd today call a hedge fund. But together, they ran only $12 million. Walter Schloss and I, though he left before long to start a hedge fund, worked together in a little room. We had a lot of fun with each other, plus we kept poring through the manuals looking for cheap stocks. We never went out to visit any companies. Ben thought that would be cheating. And when we found something terrific, Ben would put $50,000 into it. By early 1956, Ben was planning to leave the firm to go to California, and I had already decided by then to go back to Omaha. I had a terrible time telling Ben about it. I'd go into his office and come back, and then go in and not do it for a really long time. But his reaction was kind of the same as my dad would have had. Whatever's best for you. I had $9,800 at the end of 1950, and by 1956, I had $150,000. I figured with that I could live like a king, and I didn't know what I was going to do in Omaha. Maybe go to law school. I did not have a plan. I certainly didn't know I was going to start an investing partnership. But then, a couple of months later, 7 people wanted me to invest their money for them, and a partnership was the way to do it. And that began it all.
The $91 billion Conversation, October 31st, 2005, by Daniel Roth. Fair's fair. That is, if it's Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, and it's time for the University of Nebraska to finally match the event held by the University of Washington 8 years earlier. News jumped out of this conversation, which signaled that Buffett had gone a long way toward deciding that he would give his money away while he was still alive. That was a sharp swerve in his philanthropic intentions. But there had also been a swerve, a very sad one, in Buffett's life. The death in the summer of 2004 of his wife, Susie, who died from a sudden stroke. As noted earlier in this book, Buffett had always expected that Susie, 2 years younger than he, would outlive him and quickly apply her superabundant wisdom and compassion to giving his billions away. With Susie gone, the job of determining how his philanthropy should proceed had become a weight on Buffett's mind. By early 2006, though, he had settled on his stunning plan to gradually give away his Berkshire stock to 5 foundations. Chief among them, the one run by the Bill of this conversation and his wife Melinda. The Buffett Speaks Out sidebar that follows the Q&A attests to how strongly Buffett felt even in 2005 about the unfairness of the ultra-rich, including himself and Gates, of course, paying very low tax rates on their income. He made that case repeatedly in the next few years, and by 2011 had so often spoke out that his arguments, or at least something loosely resembling them, were shaped by President Obama's camp into the so-called Buffett rule. This book went to print before 2012's voters had spoken on that issue and all others before them. C.L.
It's the Friday before the University of Nebraska's Big 12 conference opener in football mad Lincoln, but the Cornhuskers game isn't the only hot ticket in town. On a beautiful late September afternoon, some 2,000 students are lined up outside the school's Lyde Center Auditorium an hour before the doors open. Andrew Schumacher, a lanky 19-year-old chemical engineering sophomore, doesn't even have a ticket, but hopes he can scrounge one to get inside. How could he miss seeing this show? After all, he says, it's Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. Gates and Buffett, friends who just happen to be the 2 richest men in the world, worth $51 billion and $40 billion, respectively, are coming together for a free-ranging question and answer session. They have done this kind of talk before, once. The two met up in Gates's hometown of Seattle in 1998 with students at the University of Washington. Back then, both men were on the verge of turbulent times. Microsoft about to face off against the government in its epic antitrust trial, and Buffett weeks away from buying reinsurer General Re, now the thorn in his company Berkshire Hathaway's side, thanks to its involvement with the troubled AIG. Fortune, the only magazine invited to attend their first chat, found the interaction something pretty darn close to wisdom, and put the talk on the cover. So when the billionaires decided to meet again, we went along for an inside peek at the event, and, more important, some private time with the 2 men to pose our own questions. Over lunch with Fortune's Daniel Roth, cherry Coke and sliced turkey on white bread for Buffett, roast beef with mustard on white for Gates, the 2 moguls loosened up, talking about their close relationship, their plans for poker that night, and Wall Street's willingness to lead investors down the wrong path. Both men are shaping up. Gates, 50 in October, has dropped 20 pounds by running regularly. Buffett, 75, has shed 12 pounds thanks to 3 times a week personal training sessions. And they're reshaping their plans as well. Buffett reverses himself and says for the first time that he may begin giving away his fortune before he dies. What follows are excerpts from that conversation. Fortune. A few quick hits. First, best book you've read lately. Buffett. Katharine Graham's Personal History is sensational. I think everybody ought to read that. Gates. There's one called The Bottomless Well about energy that I love. There's one about computer science, Ray Kurzweil's book. I have a preprint, so I'm not sure when it's coming out, called Singularity is Near, about artificial intelligence. The Tom Friedman book, The World is Flat, is super good. Jeffrey Sachs wrote a book called The End of Poverty. The Jack Welch book, Winning, came out this year. And don't forget Jared Diamond's Collapse, which is the follow-on to one of the best books of all time, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Fortune. Your last big splurge? Buffett. You mean personal expenditure? Fortune. Right. Buffett. Plane. That's the only way in which having a lot of money has changed my life. A NetJets G4. Note, Berkshire owns NetJets. I spent a couple $100,000 a year, maybe a little more. Gates. Splurge. I guess if I lose at poker tonight, it's a $500 splurge. Buffett. That is a splurge. Gates. Warren's and my betting has always been confined to $1 bets. Buffett. This fellow in Omaha called me about a poker game, and it sounded like fun. But with Texas Hold'em, you've got to play for money. That's the nature of the game. I think bridge is a better game, but poker is a lot of fun. Gates. If we had an ideal fourth here, we might have opted for bridge. Fortune. What does your friend think when you say, "Oh yeah, I'll come over for poker. Going to bring my buddy Bill Gates"? Buffett. We kept it quiet. The guy that's setting up the game knows, but the other participants don't. Fortune. Back to the lightning round. Make a call on the market. 7 years from now, will the S&P 500 have returned over or under 10% annually? Buffett. More likely to be under than over. You're not going to have the GDP in nominal terms grow 5% a year and everybody make 10% a year. Gates. I'd say under, most likely. The notion that returns will continue to be super high? There are some clouds out there. Fortune. The last time you did a talk like this, Warren, you said that people were making fairly reckless assumptions about stock market returns. Is the same thing happening today with hedge funds and private equity? Buffett. In the late 1990s, people were looking in their rearview mirror, and they thought that God had granted Americans the right to 15% a year. They built that into pension assumptions. They built it, to some extent, into what endowment funds spent. Now, 6 or 7 years later, people look in the rearview mirror and they see that conventional investments haven't produced remotely anything like that. And so they say to themselves, well, how do I get it? I'll turn to alternative investments. You can be sure that vacuum will be filled by Wall Street people who say, you're right looking into that rearview mirror and seeing conventional investments don't work. Come with us, because we have the Holy Grail. And the thing about the Holy Grail is that you have to pay a lot more. Gates. In venture capital, there were very high returns with small amounts of money, and then very poor returns with large amounts of money. This desire to have high absolute returns, and seeing that places like Harvard University were cleverly in alternative assets, has led to this thought that, okay, there must be something out there returning 10%. I just haven't found it yet. So the fact that expectations of returns exceed reality, that's still true today. Buffett. And Wall Street feeds that. Gates. It's Wall Street's job. Both laugh. Fortune. Warren gave a speech to Allen and Company this summer about his worries surrounding the ballooning U.S. trade deficit. I'm curious, Bill, whether you have the same sort of fears that Warren does. Gates. Warren has got me thinking hard about it. I watched that speech twice, and after each time I am more concerned. I believe in the basic principle that trade is a super good thing. I am very worried that the reaction to this imbalance is to put on trade restrictions to bring imports down, which would lead other nations to do similar things. I think the greatest danger is something that would slow down the benefits that the free trade system has brought. Fortune. Don't companies like yours, as they move production overseas, add to the trade deficit problem? Gates. Microsoft is a net exporter more than any other business. We do way more of our R&D here than we get in sales here. If the U.S. had about 100 more Microsofts, the trade deficit would be gone. Buffett. High tech has been one of our huge advantages. You're looking for the things in the world that you're good at, and let the other guy turn out bananas. We're never going to be good at growing bananas in this country, but I don't think the trade deficit is a stable thing. If you had a major economic disruption, and people just had a general feeling that, look at what this situation has done. you get some very bad political consequences. It's almost inevitable. Fortune. Is that your biggest fear about what happens to the U.S.? Buffett. The biggest problem we have is in terms of rogue states, terrorists, and nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. Economically, I think the U.S. is going to be fine. If the rest of the world's GDP per capita grows faster than ours, that's the way it should be. Gates. It's too bad that economics isn't taught or a hobby for lots of people, because you do run into those who seem to say, there's only a certain number of jobs. That's not the case. Let's say tomorrow we could decide that everyone in India is as rich as we are. Would the world be a better place? Certainly. Would the U.S. thrive more because of the great products and work that would be done over there? Absolutely. The world getting richer is a great thing. It has been a great thing, and it will continue to be. Buffett. It's not a zero-sum game. Gates. Right, that's the key. Fortune. You have different philosophies about philanthropy, with Bill giving a lot of his money away today, and Warren waiting until he dies to give it away. What arguments would you make to the other that your way is the right way? Buffett. Well, I think his way is better. He and Melinda, they're devoting a huge amount of money, terrific brains and heart to it. That's a great combination. I couldn't have done that when I was in my 40s and added anything meaningful. At my age now, you can argue that a very significant percentage of the money has been made, and I don't need the stock to control Berkshire, so it may make sense to do something very significant before I die. Fortune. Is this a change for you? Buffett. It's an evolution. Gates. In 1998, I was just getting started in philanthropy, and back then I would have said, look, it's too confusing and distracting to be making money and giving money away at the same time. I didn't think I could spare the time. As my dad encouraged me to jump in, as Melinda weighed in on that side, and both of them were willing to put time into it, we got a great person in Steve Ballmer, who actually I'd known at Microsoft a long time. The pieces really fell together. I'd always thought that I would wait until I was done working full-time before I'd do a lot of philanthropy, but it's worked amazingly well to be able to do some of both. Buffett. Bill's got a better mind for it. I couldn't do what he does. I wouldn't get any enjoyment, because I would know I wasn't that good at it. I want to see the money used intelligently. I don't regard my death as being the perfect timing necessarily. Fortune. Do you two talk about this? Buffett. Oh, sure. Gates. Absolutely. Fortune. Are you trying to persuade Warren to be as hands-on in philanthropy as you are? Gates. No, but I share the enjoyment I get out of it and some of the fun dynamics, the dynamics of what works and doesn't work. It's a lot like the world of business. Not enough that you can just walk into it, but you learn some of the specifics, and then the experience of business applies. Buffett. Berkshire is so much a part of me that I could never walk away from it. But I don't think that I'm going to quintuple my personal fortune in 6 or 8 years. The amount is big enough now to do very significant things, and way different than when I was in my 40s. I mean, if I had done this in my 40s, it might have been 20 million. Now we've got a sum that can do something significant. And I don't need it to control Berkshire. Nobody's going to take over Berkshire at its present size, which was not the case 20 years ago. Gates. I'd never thought that giving wealth to my own kids could be disadvantageous till I read a Fortune article. Buffett. Should you leave it all to the children? Gates. Right. Warren was a strong voice in that article. And after I read it, I thought, wow, it would be a mistake as you get past a certain amount to hand it all down. So this idea that it should all go back to society, Warren influenced me dramatically on that. Buffett. And he's doing a better job. Laughter. It's interesting that the same people who talk about the terrible cycle of dependency that welfare brings will then hand their kids, when they emerge from the womb, a lifetime supply of food stamps. But some poor woman who's had 2 pregnancies by the time she's 17, they say, oh, this is terrible to give her anything. Fortune. Warren, I know that you don't typically invest in tech companies, but I'm curious if Microsoft is looking tempting. Buffett. With Bill on my board, people would assume that I had inside information if I made money, and if I didn't make money, it wouldn't be a good idea. Both start laughing. Gates. Yeah, they'd assume I misled you. Fortune. But Bill, you've been buying more Berkshire Hathaway. Gates. Well, out of all the board members, I have the smallest percentage of my net worth in Berkshire stock. Fortune. So this isn't a takeover attempt at Berkshire? Gates, laughing. No. Buffett. If anybody takes over, I hope it's Bill. Gates. When I get up to 1%, I'll let you know. Fortune. Speaking of Berkshire, you both like its subsidiary, Dairy Queen. So the last question, Dilly Bar or Blizzard? Buffett. Well, I actually prefer something I call a dusty Sunday. But given the choice, I would have to say a Blizzard. Gates. I would pick a Dilly Bar. Later, Dan Roth talked to the men separately. Here is his Buffett report. Buffett speaks out on the idea of a flat tax. I wouldn't support it. We have, in my view, a taxation system that's much too flat already. If you look at the payroll tax, which is over 12% now, and that applies on the first $80,000 or $90,000 of income, Bill and I pay practically none of that in relation to our income. For the people that work for us, their tax rate in many cases is the same or even higher than my own, since the rate on capital gains and dividends was cut to 15%. What has gone on in this country in recent years is a huge benefit to the very rich and not that much relief to people down below. Frankly, I think that Bill and I should have a higher tax rate on the income we get. We pay less than half the rate that I was paying 25 years ago when I was making a lot less money. They have really taken care of the rich. On his worst investment decisions. The biggest mistakes are mistakes of omission rather than commission. We've never lost that much money on any one investment, but it's the things that I knew enough to do but didn't do. We have missed profits as much as $10 billion. The fact that I didn't buy Microsoft way back is not a foregone opportunity because I didn't know enough to make that decision. But there have been other investments where I did know enough, and for one reason or other I didn't invest at all, or I did on a small scale. I was sucking my thumb when I should have been writing checks, basically. But you know, if you were a golfer and you had a hole-in-one on every hole, the game wouldn't be any fun. At least that's my explanation of why I keep hitting them in the rough. On giving his money to his children. Our kids are going to be rich in the top 0.5% of the world, but 99% of what I have will go to philanthropy, and Bill has the same attitude, basically. We are not going to turn out super wealthy kids. They'll be wealthy, there's no question about that, but the idea of dynastic fortune turns me off. If you talk about equality of opportunity in this country, and really having everybody with talent having a fair shot at getting the brass ring, the idea that you hand over huge positions in society simply because someone came from the right womb, I just think it's almost un-American.
Cut your gains. March 20th, 2006. An excerpt from Buffett's letter to shareholders in the 2005 Berkshire Hathaway Annual Report. Quote, "He is such a reductionist," said a business associate of Warren Buffett's not long ago, using that uncommon word to refer to Buffett's uncommon ability to reduce a problem or issue to its essence. Buffett displays that talent in this excerpt from his 2005 shareholder letter, averring, quote, The most that owners in aggregate can earn between now and Judgment Day is what their businesses, in aggregate, earn. He then goes on, under the Cut Your Gains headline that Fortune supplied for the excerpt, to lament frictional costs and their expense effect on a family named Gotrocks. Frictional costs have been on Buffett's mind since he started his Buffett Partnership Limited in 1956. By today's definition, it was a hedge fund. But in a practice emulated by few other funds, Buffett assigned the first 6% of the fund's annual gains to his limited partners before beginning to collect any part of the gains for himself. Later, as his shareholder letters became famous, he advised most individual investors to head for low-cost index funds rather than to try to deal with the stock market themselves. Still later, he made the now famous bet against protégé partners, in which he wagered that an unmanaged and low-cost S&P index fund could over 10 years beat the performance of 5 hedge fund of funds carefully selected for this bet. The burden that limited partners in those funds bear, of course, is 2 sets of frictional costs. The first at the hedge fund level, the second at the fund of funds level. As this book is published in 2012, 4 years of the bet have passed, and the 2 sides are virtually tied. More about the bet can be found in Buffett's Big Bet, page 279. CL.
It's been an easy matter for Berkshire and other owners of American equities to prosper over the years. Between December 31st, 1899, and December 31st, 1999, to give a really long-term example, the Dow rose from 66 to 11,497. Guess what annual growth rate is required to produce this result? The surprising answer is at the end of this piece. This huge rise came about for a simple reason. Over the century, American businesses did extraordinarily well, and investors rode the wave of their prosperity. Businesses continued to do well, but now shareholders, through a series of self-inflicted wounds, are in a major way cutting the returns they will realize from their investments. The explanation of how this is happening begins with a fundamental truth. With unimportant exceptions, such as bankruptcies in which some of the company's losses are borne by creditors, the most that owners in aggregate can earn between now and Judgment Day is what their businesses in aggregate earn. True, by buying and selling that is clever or lucky, investor A may take more than his share of the pie at the expense of investor B, and yes, all investors feel richer when stocks soar, but an owner can exit only by having someone take his place. If one investor sells high, another must buy high. For owners as a whole, there is simply no magic, no shower of money from outer space that will enable them to extract wealth from their companies beyond that created by the companies themselves. Indeed, owners must earn less than their businesses earn because of frictional costs. And that's my point. These costs are now being incurred in amounts that will cause shareholders to earn far less than they historically have. To understand how this toll has ballooned, imagine for a moment that all American corporations are, and always will be, owned by a single family. We'll call them the Gotrocks. After paying taxes on dividends, this family, generation after generation, becomes richer by the aggregate amount earned by its companies. Today, that amount is about $700 billion annually. Naturally, the family spends some of these dollars, but the portion it saves steadily compounds for its benefit. In the Gotrocks household, everyone grows wealthier at the same pace, and all is harmonious. But let's now assume that a few fast-talking helpers approach the family and persuade each of its members to try to outsmart its relatives by buying certain of their holdings and selling them certain others. The helpers, for a fee of course, obligingly agree to handle these transactions. The Gottrocks still own all of corporate America. The trades just rearrange who owns what. So the family's annual gain in wealth diminishes, equaling the earnings of American business minus commissions paid. The more that family members trade, the smaller their share of the pie, and the larger the slice received by the helpers. This fact is not lost upon these broker helpers. Activity is their friend, and in a wide variety of ways they urge it on. After a while, most of the family members realize that they are not doing so well in this new beat my brother game. Enter another set of helpers. These newcomers explain to each member of the Gottrocks clan that by himself he'll never outsmart the rest of the family. The suggested cure: hire a manager, yes, us, and get the job done professionally. These manager helpers continue to use the broker helpers to execute trades. The managers may even increase their activity so as to permit the brokers to prosper still more. Overall, a bigger slice of the pie now goes to the two classes of helpers. The family's disappointment grows. Each of its members is now employing professionals, yet overall, the group's finances have taken a turn for the worse. The solution? More help, of course. It arrives in the form of financial planners and institutional consultants who weigh in to advise the Gottrocks on selecting manager helpers. The befuddled family welcomes this assistance. By now, its members know they can pick neither the right stocks nor the right stock pickers. Why, one might ask, should they expect success in picking the right consultant? But this question does not occur to the Gottrocks, and the consultant helpers certainly don't suggest it to them. The Gottrocks, now supporting 3 classes of expensive helpers, find that their results get worse, and they sink into despair. But just as hope seems lost, a 4th group, we'll call them the hyper-helpers, appears. These friendly folk explain to the Gottrocks that their unsatisfactory results are occurring because the existing helpers, brokers, managers, consultants, are not sufficiently motivated and are simply going through the motions. What, the new helpers ask, can you expect from such a bunch of zombies? The new arrivals offer a breathtakingly simple solution. Pay more money. Brimming with self-confidence, the hyper-helpers assert that huge contingent payments, in addition to stiff fixed fees, are what each family member must fork over in order to really outmaneuver his relatives. The more observant members of the family see that some of the hyper-helpers are really just manager helpers wearing new uniforms, bearing sewn-on sexy names like hedge fund or private equity. The new helpers, however, assure the Gottrocks that this change of clothing is all important, bestowing on its wearers magical powers similar to those acquired by mild-mannered Clark Kent when he changed into his Superman costume. Calmed by this explanation, the family decides to pay up. And that's where we are today. A record portion of the earnings that would go in their entirety to owners if they all just stayed in their rocking chairs is now going to a swelling army of helpers. Particularly expensive is the recent pandemic of profit arrangements under which helpers receive large portions of the winnings when they are smart or lucky, and leave family members with all the losses and large fixed fees to boot when the helpers are dumb or unlucky or occasionally crooked. A sufficient number of arrangements like this, heads, the helper takes much of the winnings, tails, the Gottrocks lose and pay dearly for the privilege of doing so, may make it more accurate to call the family the Hadrocks. Today, in fact, the family's frictional costs of all sorts may well amount to 20% of the earnings of American business. In other words, the burden of paying helpers may cause American equity investors overall to earn only 80% or so of what they would earn if they just sat still and listened to no one. Long ago, Sir Isaac Newton gave us 3 laws of motion, which were the work of genius. But Sir Isaac's talents did not extend to investing. He lost a bundle in the South Sea bubble, explaining later, "I can calculate the movement of the stars, but not the madness of men." If he had not been traumatized by this loss, Sir Isaac might well have gone on to discover the 4th law of motion. For investors as a whole, returns decrease as motion increases. Here's the answer to the question posed at the beginning of this piece. To get very specific, the Dow increased from 65.73 to 11,497.12 in the 20th century, and that amounts to a gain of 5.3% compounded annually. Investors would have also received dividends, of course. To achieve an equal rate of gain in the 21st century, the Dow will have to rise by December 31st, 2099 to, brace yourself, precisely 2,011,011.23. But I'm willing to settle for 2 million. 6 years into this century, the Dow has gained not at all.
Buffett's Alter Ego, May 29, 2006, by Andy Serwer. The matchup of Warren Buffett and Charles Munger is regarded as so perfect, so impossible to imagine not happening, that 2 different Omahans claim they made the introduction. This argument will not be settled here. But it is worth recalling what one of the contenders, Richard Holland, has written in his book, Truth and Other Tall Tales, about the evening in which he claims to have brought the pair together. Quote, "Our living room was arranged with 2 chairs in one corner for conversations, and that's where Warren and Charlie parked for the evening. To my memory, they never got out of their chairs nor stopped talking until it was time to leave. Charlie talked so much he hyperventilated occasionally." In the article that follows, Andy Serwer describes the unique talents that Munger brings to the Berkshire Party, among them making the annual meeting the best 2-man show that never made it to Broadway. For this introduction, I thought it might be interesting as well to ask Charlie himself to look back on his Buffett Berkshire years and articulate, in his distinctive way, what he thinks have been the most important contributions he has made to the extraordinary success that Berkshire has become. He didn't quite rise to that bait. Instead, he employed a pronoun, we. That is an integral part of Berkshire's culture. Said Charlie, "We chose our style of operation to fit our natures, which demanded that plenty of time be spent thinking and learning, while engaging in lifelong self-criticism, light contrition for every error, and much humor. Naturally, this caused extreme delegation, which is what we would have wanted as recipients of trust. We knew our methods would create good financial results for us and those who relied on us. But we did not anticipate that we would draw so much more admiration than we deserved, and that this would help us to be happy, as we in effect became teachers who to some extent copied Warren's mentor, Ben Graham." C.L.
Ask folks about Berkshire Hathaway, and most will tell you that it's Warren Buffett's company, which is true as far as it goes. But those in the know recognize that Berkshire's success is actually the product of a tag team effort by Buffett and his long-standing partner, Charlie Munger. Sure, Buffett is the top banana. He's the chairman and CEO as well as the very public face of the company, while Munger is merely vice chairman and more of a behind-the-scenes type. But Munger has long been the co-thinker at Berkshire, which is no small thing. In early May, I made the pilgrims to Omaha to attend Berkshire's now world-famous annual meeting and to get a taste of what Munger calls festival capitalism. I had another agenda, however, which was to do some close-up Munger watching, and also to sit down with him and pick his brain. You've probably read plenty about Berkshire's annual meetings, and I have too, but it was still a surreal experience to stroll into the filled-to-capacity Quest Center in Omaha and find 17,000 shareholders plus another 7,000 spread throughout the facility in overflow rooms. And almost every single one of them, many of whom are multimillionaires, was sitting in rapt attention as a couple of geezers, Buffett is 75 and Munger is 82, waxed on for some 5 hours. It's the kind of scene where you'd expect to see a couple of high-powered motivational speakers, which, in a sense, is what Buffett and Munger are. Over the years, the Buffett and Munger show has taken on a somewhat formulaic choreography. The two men sit center stage, facing a dark sea of shareholders. Questions are usually fielded first by Buffett, who will answer and then ramble a bit in his inimitable way, often with a one-liner or two mixed in, for 5 minutes or so. At that point, he will look over to his partner and inquire, "Charlie?" Then one of two things occurs. Munger will either lean in and make a point, pithy, often scathing comment, which sometimes elicits gasps or loud guffaws from the crowd, or Munger will simply remark, "I have nothing to say," which, after a particularly long-winded Buffett digression, can be amusing as well. After that, Buffett likes to come back for a 2-minute coda. This goes on for 2.5 hours in the morning. Then there's a break for lunch, and then another couple of hours in the afternoon. "We stumbled into this 2-person format," Munger told me the day after this year's marathon. "It would not work if it was just one person. You could have the wittiest, wisest person on earth up there, and people would find it very tiresome. It takes a little interplay of personalities to handle the extreme length of the festival." Berkshire watchers say that Munger, who can be prickly and does not suffer fools particularly well, has been coming into his own lately. Unlike Buffett, who intends to engage in post-mortem philanthropy, Munger has been actively doling out big bucks, mostly to educational and health care causes in his adopted state of California. And then there's the lavish coffee table book, Poor Charlie's Almanac, The Wit and Wisdom of Charles T. Munger, the second edition of which came out just in time for this year's annual meeting. The book's title and conceit is, of course, a nod to Benjamin Franklin, a man whom Munger generally admires. "There is the sheer amount of Franklin's wisdom," says Munger, who just for a second flashes a cherubic grin, "and the talent. Franklin played 4 instruments. He was the nation's leading scientist and inventor, plus a leading author, statesman, and philanthropist. There has never been anyone like him." To Berkshire shareholders, Munger is pretty singular himself. "Warren is obviously so brilliant," one stockholder told me, "but I just love what Charlie says." In a way, Buffett and Munger remind me of the Rolling Stones. Buffett, like Mick Jagger, is certainly the main dude, but many believe that Munger, like Keith Richards, is just as cool, if not more so. Let's just hope that Munger stays out of coconut trees. So, what were some of Charlie's zingers this year? Well, at one point, Buffett was talking about his shareholders investing on their own, which he said would work out just fine for many of them. To which Charlie followed up, "Many of you won't do fine." Munger blasted auditors, saying they are contemptible, they've totally sold out. Corrupt foreign governments are kleptocracies. A well-regarded author of business books is demented. As for executive comp, America is exporting poison to Europe, he says. The hedge fund and private equity businesses are due for a comeuppance at some point, and Wall Street is filled with racetrack touts and so on. But Munger isn't just about calling out charlatans. Many Mungerisms are exercises in humility and simple wisdom. Warren and I avoid doing anything that someone else at Berkshire can do better, he tells me. You don't really have a competency if you don't know the edge of it. On the eve of the meeting, Berkshire announced that for $4 billion it had purchased an 80% stake in Iskar, an Israeli metal-cutting tool manufacturer, and Berkshire's first acquisition overseas. In Iskar, Munger says he and his partner have found management with super talent and super integrity. I hear that Munger, who's usually more skeptical of deals than Buffett, was highly enthusiastic about Iskar from the get-go, and even more eager to do the deal than Buffett. Who the hell wouldn't be excited about this deal, Munger says. What's always been maddening to me about Berkshire and Buffett and Munger is how they make both their business and the art of investing, which I find to be so complicated and bewildering, seem so simple. Berkshire is in the business of making easy predictions, Munger explains. If a deal looks too hard, the partners simply shelve it. But the line of Munger's that I really remember best from this year's meeting is, "We have a high moral responsibility to be rational," he says. Think about that for a minute. Have you ever heard any business leader describe their charge thusly? There's a reason that there's just one Berkshire Hathaway and one Warren Buffett. And one Charlie Munger, too.
Buffett backs GM and buys a caddy. May 29, 2006. By Alex Taylor III.
Warren Buffett isn't one of those guys who always has to have the fanciest bling on the block. This is, after all, the billionaire who loves to dine at Dairy Queen. And his daily commute takes only 5 minutes. But after he saw Rick Wagoner, the chairman and CEO of General Motors, on CBS's Face the Nation in early April, Buffett decided it was time to splurge for a new ride. He faxed Wagoner a note that praised him for being candid, composed, and rational in discussing problems that GM faced that weren't of his making, and added a P.S. "I don't buy cars very often, but the next one will be a Cadillac." Wagoner wrote back offering to help Buffett with the purchase, but it wasn't necessary. Buffett dispatched his daughter to a nearby dealer so that he could, as he put it, cast one vote for the guy. She picked out a DTS, a sedan that is the model of choice for senior citizen drivers and starts at $41,900. "I think I'll become a car salesman because I would have no trouble selling this car to anyone," Buffett says. "I'm behind GM 100%. In case you were wondering, he paid cash.
The philanthropist emerges. In early May of 2006, I went into the office of my managing editor, Eric Pooley, shut his door, and told him we had a chance to break a big story. "As you know," I said in these general words, "Warren Buffett has always said that most of his fortune would go to charity, but has never spelled out any plan for making that happen. Now he's set to announce in June that he will start the giving right away. His money will gradually go to 5 foundations, and the biggest recipient by far will be the Gates Foundation. Fortune can do a story, a Q&A with him maybe, in which we can disclose all this, if we want it." Eric looked stunned, but in a microsecond said, "We want it." No doubt thinking immediately of a cover story, he said we needed to call in Greg Pond, the head of our photo department. When Greg arrived, Eric asked me to repeat my news. I began the recital, and when I got to the part about where the money would go, Eric interrupted and said, in a voice that surely penetrated the closed door, "And he's giving it to Bill Gates?" Buffett wanted to make his announcement in late June, and we scheduled our article for an issue closing June 23rd. But the story did not go on the tentative list made up for each issue, which is routinely circulated to the staff. Instead, a small team of us huddled over the secret while quietly carrying out the normal workings of a magazine. Reporting, writing, and editing took place. A photographer who didn't exactly know what the story was set up a cover shoot. Our art director pulled into the secret designed pages and a cover. In what amounted to a small miracle, we managed to keep this story absolutely secret from even the staff for more than a month. It was not until a few days before publication that some bright soul asked in our morning meeting, "Is there maybe some story that we don't know about that's in this issue?" Eric Pooley said there was indeed, and that the absence of further questions would be appreciated. When Fortune's public relations crew put out a long press release on Sunday, June 25th, that disclosed the news, it was a complete surprise to the world and most of the magazine's staff. Buffett made his first gifts to the 5 foundations in August 2006, and they have continued each summer. Counting all the donations made through 2012, he has given about $13.3 billion to the 5 donees. Of that, about $11 billion went to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, $1.1 billion to the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation, and $1.2 billion, that is, close to $400 million apiece, to the foundations run by his 3 children. Because the contributions to all the foundations are a set, though annually declining, number of Berkshire Hathaway's shares, the value of what Buffett gives swings yearly with the price of Berkshire stock. As one example, the gifts to the Gates Foundation have ranged from a high of $1.8 billion in the cliff-hanging year of 2008 down to a low of $1.25 billion in battered 2009. One note: the data given for the Berkshire B shares in this article and the one that follows are not adjusted for the 50-to-1 split of the shares that took place in 2010. CL. Warren Buffett Gives It Away, July 10, 2006, by Carol Loomis. We were sitting in a Manhattan living room on a spring afternoon, and Warren Buffett had a cherry Coke in his hand, as usual. But this unremarkable scene was about to take a surprising turn. "Brace yourself," Buffett warned with a grin. He then described a momentous change in his thinking. Within months, he said, he would begin to give away his Berkshire Hathaway fortune, then and now worth well over $40 billion. This news was indeed stunning. Buffett, 75, has for decades said his wealth would go to philanthropy, but has just as steadily indicated the handoff would be made at his death. Now he was revising the timetable. "I know what I want to do," he said, "and it makes sense to get going." On that spring day, his plan was uncertain in some of its details. Today it is essentially complete. And it is typical Buffett: rational, original, breaking the mold of how extremely rich people donate money. Buffett has pledged to gradually give 85% of his Berkshire stock to 5 foundations. A dominant 5/6 of the shares will go to the world's largest philanthropic organization, the $30 billion Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whose principals are close friends of Buffett's, a connection that began in 1991 when a mutual friend introduced Buffett and Bill Gates. The Gateses credit Buffett, says Bill, with having inspired their thinking about giving money back to society. Their foundation's activities, internationally famous, are focused on world health, fighting diseases such as malaria, HIV/AIDS, and tuberculosis, and on improving U.S. libraries and high schools. Up to now, the 2 Gateses have been the only trustees of their foundation. But as his plan gets underway, Buffett will be joining them. Bill Gates says he and his wife are thrilled by that, and by knowing that Buffett's money will allow the foundation to both deepen and accelerate its work. The generosity and trust Warren has shown, Gates adds, is incredible. Beginning in July and continuing every year, Buffett will give a set, annually declining number of Berkshire B shares, starting with 602,500 in 2006, and then decreasing by 5% per year to the 5 foundations. The gifts to the Gates Foundation will be made either by Buffett or through his estate, as long as at least one of the pair, Bill, now 50, or Melinda, 41, is active in it. Berkshire's price on the date of each gift will determine its dollar value. Were B shares, for example, to be $3,071 in July, that was their close on June 23rd, Buffett's 2006 gift to the foundation, 500,000 shares, would be worth about $1.5 billion. With so much new money to handle, the foundation will be given 2 years to resize its operations. But it will then be required by the terms of Buffett's gift to annually spend the dollar amount of his contributions as well as those it is already making from its existing assets. At the moment, $1.5 billion would roughly double the foundation's yearly benefactions. But the $1.5 billion has little relevance to the value of Buffett's future gifts, since their amount will depend on the price of Berkshire's stock when they are made. If the stock rises yearly, on average by even a modest amount, say 6%, the gain will more than offset the annual 5% decline in the number of shares given. Under those circumstances, the value of Buffett's contributions will rise. Buffett himself thinks that will happen. Or, to state that proposition more directly, he believes the price of Berkshire, and with it the dollar size of the contributions, will trend upward, perhaps over time increasing substantially. The other foundation gifts that Buffett is making will also occur annually and start in July. At Berkshire's current price, the combined 2006 total of these gifts will be $315 million. The contributions will go to foundations headed by Buffett's 3 children, Susan, Howard, and Peter, and to the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation. This last foundation was for 40 years known simply as the Buffett Foundation and was recently renamed in honor of Buffett's late wife, Susie, who died in 2004 at 72 after a stroke. Her will bestows about $2.5 billion on the foundation, to which her husband's gifts will be added. The foundation has mainly focused on reproductive health, family planning, and pro-choice causes, and on preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. Counting the gifts to all 5 foundations, Buffett will gradually but sharply reduce his holdings of Berkshire stock. He now owns close to 31% of the company, worth nearly $44 billion in late June, and that proportion will ultimately be cut to around 5%. Sticking to his long-term intentions, Buffett says the residual 5%, worth about $6.8 billion today, will in time go for philanthropy also, perhaps in his lifetime, and, if not, at his death. Because the value of Buffett's gifts are tied to a future unknowable price of Berkshire, there is no way to put a total dollar value on them. But the number of shares earmarked to be given have a huge value today, $37 billion. That alone would be the largest philanthropic gift in history. And if Buffett is right in thinking that Berkshire's price will trend upward, the eventual amount given could far exceed that figure. So that's the plan. What follows is a conversation in which Buffett explains how he moved away from his original thinking and decided to begin giving now. The questioner is yours truly, Fortune Editor-at-Large Carol Loomis. I am a longtime friend of Buffett's, a Berkshire Hathaway shareholder, and a director of the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation. Coming from you, this plan is pretty startling. Up to now, you haven't been famous for giving away money. In fact, you've been roundly criticized now and then for not giving it away. So let's cut to the obvious question. Are you ill? No, absolutely not. I feel terrific. And when I had my last physical in October, my doctor gave me a clean bill of health. Then what's going on here? Does your change in plans have something to do with Susie's death? Yes, it does. Susie was 2 years younger than I, and women usually live longer than men. She and I always assumed that she would inherit my Berkshire stock and be the one who oversaw the distribution of our wealth to society, where both of us had always said it would go. And Susie would have enjoyed overseeing the process. She was a little afraid of it in terms of scaling up, but she would have liked doing it and would have been very good at it. And she would really have stepped on the gas. By that you mean she always wanted to give away more money, faster than you did. Yes, she said that many times. As for me, I always had the idea that philanthropy was important today, but would be equally important in 1 year, 10 years, 20 years, and the future generally. And someone who was compounding money at a high rate, I thought, was the better party to be taking care of the philanthropy that was to be done 20 years out, while the people compounding at a lower rate should logically take care of the current philanthropy. But that theory also happened to fit what you wanted to do, right? He laughs, hard. And how? No question about that. I was having fun, and still am having fun, doing what I do. And for a while, I also thought in terms of control of Berkshire. I had bought effective control of Berkshire in the early 1970s, using $15 million I got when I disbanded Buffett Partnership. And I had very little money, considerably less than the $1 million outside of Berkshire. My salary was $50,000 a year. So if I had engaged in significant philanthropy back then, I would have had to give away shares of Berkshire. I hadn't bought those to immediately give them away. Even so, you and Susie set up the Buffett Foundation way back in the 1960s, which means you obviously expected to be giving away money sometime. What was your thinking back then? Well, when we got married in 1952, I told Susie I was going to be rich. That wasn't going to be because of any special virtues of mine or even because of hard work, but simply because I was born with the right skills, in the right place, at the right time. I was wired at birth to allocate capital, and was lucky enough to have people around me early on, my parents and teachers and Susie, who helped me to make the most of that. In any case, Susie didn't get very excited when I told her we were going to get rich. She either didn't care or didn't believe me, probably both, in fact. But to the extent we did amass wealth, we were totally in sync about what to do with it, and that was to give it back to society. In that, we agreed with Andrew Carnegie, who said that huge fortunes that flow in large part from society should in large part be returned to society. In my case, the ability to allocate capital would have had little utility unless I lived in a rich, populous country in which enormous quantities of marketable securities were traded and were sometimes ridiculously mispriced. And fortunately for me, that describes the U.S. in the second half of the last century. Certainly neither Susie nor I ever thought we should pass huge amounts of money along to our children. Our kids are great, but I would argue that when your kids have all the advantages anyway, in terms of how they grow up and the opportunities they have for education, including what they learn at home, I would say it's neither right nor rational to be flooding them with money. In effect, they've had a gigantic head start in a society that aspires to be a meritocracy. Dynastic mega-wealth would further tilt the playing field that we ought to be trying instead to level. From the fact that you've given your kids money before to set up foundations and are planning to give them more now, I gather you don't think that kind of flooding them with money is wrong. No, I don't. What they're doing with their foundations is giving money back to society, just where Susie and I thought it should go. And they aren't just writing checks. They've put enormous thought and effort into the process. I'm very proud of them for the way they've handled it all, and I have no doubt they're going to keep on the right track. So what about the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation and what all this means for it? As you know, because as a director you've seen it up close, Alan Greenberg, the foundation's president, has done an excellent and thoughtful job of running it. His results-to-cost ratio is as good as I've ever seen, and he'll keep on that same path now, not just with Susie's money, but with mine too. Actually, if I had died before Susie and she had begun to distribute our wealth, this is the foundation that would have scaled up to a much bigger size. Right now it has only 5 employees, and become her main vehicle for giving. And the foundation anchored my plans, too. Until I changed my thoughts about when to give, this was to be where my fortune would go also. And what changed your mind? The short answer is that I came to realize that there was a terrific foundation that was already scaled up, that wouldn't have to go through the real grind of getting to a mega size like the Buffett Foundation would, and that could productively use my money now. The longer answer is that over the years I had gotten to know Bill and Melinda Gates well, spent a lot of time with them having fun, and way beyond that had grown to admire what they were doing with their foundation. I've seen them give presentations about its programs, and I'm always amazed at the enthusiasm and passion and energy they're pouring into their work. They've gone at it, you might say, with both head and heart. Bill reads many thousands of pages annually, keeping up with medical advances and means of delivering help. Melinda, often with Bill along, travels the world, looking at how well good intentions are being converted into good results. Life has dealt a terrible hand to literally billions of people around the world, and Bill and Melinda are bent on reducing that inequity to the extent they possibly can. If you think about it, if your goal is to return the money to society by attacking truly major problems that don't have a commensurate funding base, what could you find that's better than turning to a couple of people who are young, who are ungodly bright, whose ideas have been proven, who already have shown an ability to scale it up and do it right? You don't get an opportunity like that ordinarily. I'm getting 2 people enormously successful at something, where I've had a chance to see what they've done, where I know they will keep doing it, where they've done it with their own money. So they're not living in some fantasy world, and where, in general, I agree with their reasoning. If I've found the right vehicle for my goal, there's no reason to wait. Compare what I'm doing with them to my situation at Berkshire, where I have talented and proven people in charge of our businesses. They do a much better job than I could in running their operations. What can be more logical, in whatever you want done, than finding someone better equipped than you are to do it? Who wouldn't select Tiger Woods to take his place in a high-stakes golf game? That's how I feel about this decision about my money. People will be very curious, I think, as to how much your decision and its announcement at this particular time is connected to Bill Gates's announcement in mid-June that he would phase out of his operating responsibilities at Microsoft and begin to devote most of his time to the foundation. What's the story here? I realize that the close timing of the 2 announcements will suggest they're related, but they aren't in the least. The timing is just happenstance. I would be disclosing my plans right now whether or not he had announced his move, and even, in fact, if he were indefinitely keeping on with all of his work at Microsoft. On the other hand, I'm pleased he's going to be devoting more time to the foundation, and I think he and Melinda are pleased to know they're going to be working with more resources. Does it occur to you that it's somewhat ironic for the second richest man in the world to be giving untold billions to the first richest man? When you put it that way, it sounds pretty funny. But in truth, I'm giving it through them, and importantly, Melinda as well, not to him. Some people say the Gates Foundation is bureaucratic, and bureaucracy is just about your number one dislike. So how do you react to that charge? I would say that most large organizations, though Berkshire is a shining exception, are bureaucratic to some degree. Anyway, what some people really mean when they claim that the Gates Foundation is bureaucratic is that big decisions don't get made by anybody except Bill and Melinda. That suits me fine. I want the two of them to make the big calls. What is the significance of your going on the board of the Gates Foundation? Not much. The biggest reason for my doing that is if they were ever to go down on an airplane together. Beyond that, I hope to have a constructive thought now and then, but I don't think I'm as well cut out to be a philanthropist as Bill and Melinda are. The feedback on philanthropy is very slow, and that would bother me. I'd have to be too involved with a lot of people I wouldn't want to be involved with, and have to listen to more opinions than I would enjoy. In philanthropy also, you have to make some big mistakes. I know that. But it would bother me more to make the mistakes myself, rather than having someone else make them who I trust overall to do a good job. In general, Bill and Melinda will have a better batting average than I would. Did you talk this huge decision over with other people before deciding to go ahead with the plan? Yes, I talked to my children, and Alan Greenberg, and to 4 Berkshire directors, including my son Howard and Charlie Munger. I got lots of questions, and some people had qualms about the plan initially because it was such an abrupt change from what they had been anticipating. But I'd say everybody, and that certainly includes Alan, who knows what a bear it would have been to scale up the Buffett Foundation, came around to seeing the logic of what I was proposing to do. Now all concerned can't wait to get started, particularly me. And frankly, I have some small hopes that what I'm doing might encourage other very rich people thinking about philanthropy to decide they didn't necessarily have to set up their own foundations, but could look around for the best of those that were up and running and available to handle their money. People do that all the time with their investments. They put their money with people they think are going to do a better job than they could. There's some real merit to extending that thought to your wealth, rather than setting up something to be run after your death by a bunch of old business cronies or a staff that eventually comes to dictate the agenda. Some version of this plan I've got is not a crazy thing for some of the next 20 people who are going to die with $1 billion or more to adopt themselves. One problem most rich people have is that they're old, with contemporaries who are not at their peak years and who don't have much time ahead of them. I'm lucky in that respect, in that I can turn to younger people. Okay, now what does that mean for Berkshire? I'd say virtually nothing. Anybody who knows me also knows how I feel about making Berkshire as good as it can be, and that goal is still going to be there. I won't do anything differently, because I'm not capable of doing things differently. The name on the stock certificates will change, but nothing else will. I've always made it clear to Berkshire's shareholders that my wealth from the company would go to philanthropy, so the fact that I'm starting the process is basically a non-event for them. And, you know, though this may surprise some people, it's a non-event for me too in some ways. Ted Turner, whose philanthropic activities I admire enormously, once told me that his hands shook when he signed a $1 billion pledge. Well, I have 0 of that. To me, there's just no emotional downside to this at all. Won't the foundations that are getting your stock need to sell it? Yes, in some cases. The Buffett Foundation and the Kids Foundations will have to sell their stock relatively soon after they get it, because it will be their only asset, and they'll need to raise cash to give it away. The Gates Foundation will have more options because it has lots of other assets, so it will have some flexibility to choose which it should turn into cash. Bill and Melinda will make the decisions about that. I'm going to totally insulate myself from any investment decisions their foundation makes, which leaves them free to do whatever they think makes sense. Perhaps they will decide to sell bigger portions of other assets and hang on to some Berkshire. It's a great mix of businesses and wouldn't be an inappropriate asset for a foundation to own. But I won't tie the foundation up in any shape or form. So it could be that all the shares you give annually will be sold in the market. Yes, that may well happen. And naturally, people are going to be interested in whether that selling could weigh down Berkshire's price. I don't think so in the least. And that's true even though the annual turnover ratio for Berkshire has been running only about 15% a year, which is extremely low for large-cap stocks. Let's say the 5 foundations sell all the stock they get this year. If trading volume continues as it has, their selling will raise turnover to less than 17%. It would be ridiculous to think that much new selling could affect the price of the stock. In fact, the added supply could even be beneficial in increasing the stock's liquidity and should make it more likely that Berkshire would eventually be included in the S&P 500. I'd say this: I would not be making the gifts if they would in any way harm Berkshire's shareholders, and they won't. This plan seems to settle the fate, over the long term, of all your Berkshire shares. Does that mean you're giving nothing to your family in straight-out gifts? No. What I've always said is that my family won't receive huge amounts of my net worth. That doesn't mean they'll get nothing. My children have already received some money from me and Susie and will receive more. I still believe in the philosophy, Fortune quoted me saying this 20 years ago, that a very rich person should leave his kids enough to do anything but not enough to do nothing. Remember I said that way back when I was buying Berkshire I had less than $1 million in outside cash? Well, I've made a few decent investments with that money in the years since, taking positions that were too small for Berkshire, doing some fixed income arbitrage, and selling my interest in a bank that was split off from Berkshire. So I'm glad to say I've got quite a bit of cash now. Overall, I can, and will, use my Berkshire shares for philanthropic purposes and will have plenty left over to provide well for all those close to me. What the legends gave. Their philanthropies were immense, given the small economic worlds of their time. But Buffett's contribution is miles bigger. Philanthropist Andrew Carnegie, from 1902 to 1919, gave $350 million. In current dollars, $7.2 billion. John D. Rockefeller, from 1889 to 1937, gave $530 million. In current dollars, $7.1 billion. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., 1927 to 1960, gave $475 million. In current dollars, $5.5 billion. Fortune Table / Sources, American Philanthropy by Robert H. Bremner, Fortune Research. How Buffett's Giveaway Will Work, July 10, 2006, by Carol Loomis. The mind that built the fortune also came up with a complex plan to hand it off. Warren Buffett holds only Berkshire Hathaway A stock, 474,998 shares. But his gifts are to be made in Berkshire B stock, into which each A share is convertible at a ratio of 30-1. He will convert A shares to obtain the B shares he needs for his gifts. Buffett is earmarking a set number of B shares for each of the 5 foundations he has chosen to receive his gifts. In 2006, he will give 5% of the designated shares to each recipient. The next year, the gifts will be 5% of the residual shares and so on for every year until either Buffett's death or until certain conditions are no longer met at the foundations. At Buffett's death, his estate will distribute, in a way not yet definite, the remaining earmarked shares. Here are the recipients and the number of B shares to be allocated to them. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, 10 million shares. This foundation, the largest in the world, has around $30 billion of assets right now and has given away $8 billion in its 12 years of existence. Most of its money, typically funneled through partners, has gone to World Health programs and U.S. education. Buffett's gifts to this foundation will continue only as long as either Bill or Melinda Gates is alive and active in its work. Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation, 1 million shares. Once called simply the Buffett Foundation, the renamed in 2004 for Buffett's wife who died that year, this foundation has $270 million in assets. Most of its funds came from the estate of Susan T. Buffett, and $2.1 billion more is expected from that source. This foundation has focused on reproductive health, family planning, and pro-choice causes, and on preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. Susan A. Buffett Foundation, 350,000 shares. This philanthropy is named for and chaired by Buffett's daughter, 52, who lives in Omaha, and who has also chaired the Susan Buffett Thompson Foundation since her mother's death. The daughter's foundation, which today has $118 million in assets, has funded early education for children of low-income families. With her father's new gifts, Susan Buffett expects to continue that work and expand into public education and foster care grants. Howard G. Buffett Foundation, 350,000 shares. Now holding $129 million in assets, this foundation was set up by Buffett's older son, 51, who farms 840 acres outside Decatur, Illinois, and is on several corporate boards, including Berkshire's. His middle name, by the way, is Graham, for famed investor Ben Graham. This foundation's giving has been very international, taking in 42 countries, and often aimed at conservation goals, such as the protection of African wildlife habitats. But with its new money, the foundation plans to move much more heavily into clean water projects, food relief, the plight of children entangled in illegal immigration, and other humanitarian areas. Novo Foundation, 350,000 shares. Named for the Latin word novo, meaning I alter, this foundation is run by Peter Buffett, 48, a musician and composer, and his wife Jennifer, who live in New York City. Currently holding $120 million in assets, it has focused on funding individuals and organizations working to open up education opportunities, reverse environmental degradation, uphold human rights, and improve understanding and respect among various cultures and ethnicities. Would you like that $11 billion in 20s? July 24th, 2006, by Carol Loomis. On July 3rd, Warren Buffett drove himself downtown, walked into the cavernous and nearly deserted central branch of U.S. Bank in Omaha, descended a flight of steps, and opened his large safe deposit box. He took out a 1979 dated certificate for 121,737 shares of Berkshire Hathaway A stock, on that day worth about $11 billion, roughly 1/4 of his Berkshire fortune. Driving back to his office, he pondered the next step. Getting that certificate, and a few others, worth only tens of millions, to Wells Fargo in Minneapolis for conversion at a 30-to-1 ratio into around 3.75 million shares of Berkshire B stock. He considered FedEx, and elected instead to turn one of the 16 people working at Berkshire headquarters into a courier. As Fortune first reported last month, Buffett has begun to give his money to charity. Converting the astoundingly valuable 1979 certificate is an initial step in that process. When it is switched over, Buffett will have the B stock he needs for handing out the 602,500 shares he has committed this year, the first of his huge philanthropic program to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and 4 smaller foundations. Because of the size of that one certificate, he will also be up to his eyeballs in B shares, having manufactured enough to fill his giving needs for most of the next decade. He'll keep the excess shares in a brokerage account to be used as needed. Buffett says the whole exercise on July 3rd made him think of the time almost 70 years ago when he was 6 years old and his father, Howard Buffett, took him to the same bank to open a $20 savings account. The money was a gift. The bank was then called Omaha National, and the small passbook he got was maroon. After that, he says, it took him 5 years of gifts, chores, and money-earning schemes to build the account to $120. Having accrued this fortune, he bought, at age 11, his first stock, 3 shares of Cities Service Preferred for $114. Well, if you are going to amass $44 billion, you have to start someplace. Buffett to Gates. Spend It. March 19, 2007. By Jia Lin Yang. Last summer, Warren Buffett stunned the business world when he told Fortune that he would give away the bulk of his $44 billion Berkshire Hathaway fortune to charity. Now comes the news that in the latest Berkshire annual report, Buffett states strict rules about what should happen to any Berkshire shares he retains when he dies, rules that challenge the way most charitable foundations are run. As he previously said, these shares will go to charity, but the new stipulations are all about speed. Once his estate is closed, which he estimates will take 3 years, every dollar of his gifts must be used within 10 years. By establishing this timetable, Buffett has thrust himself into a long-running debate. Should foundations focus their spending on resources or perpetuating them? And because of his reputation and the scale of his wealth, Buffett's endorsement of the latter is a landmark moment in philanthropy. The vast majority of large foundations operate with the intent of lasting forever, and therefore rarely exceed the minimum spending ratio of 5%, calculated on an organization's asset value of the previous year, which they need to retain tax-exempt status. According to data compiled by Buffett's staff, 28 of the 30 largest foundations paid out less than 5% of assets in grants in 2005. They reached the 5% threshold by counting operating costs. But a small number of foundations, both past and current, have decided to follow a spend-down model. Why? Many want greater control over how their money is used. As Buffett writes in the Berkshire Annual Report, quote, "I've set this schedule because I want the money to be spent more promptly by people I know to be capable, vigorous, and motivated." Buffett's gifts are going to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, 3 foundations run by his children, and the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation, named after his late first wife. The Gateses, too, have put a time limit on the spending of their donations, stipulating that their foundation must disperse all the money within 50 years of their death. Quote, "As foundations grow over time, the risk of bureaucracy and mission drift grows," says Harvey Dale, director of New York University's National Center on Philanthropy and the Law. Dale is also the former president, CEO, and now director of Atlantic Philanthropies, an oft-cited modern example of a spend-down foundation. Adds Dale, spending down focuses the mind. But don't expect the Ford Foundation to go on a wild spending spree or to go out of business anytime soon. Quote, "Foundations set up in perpetuity aren't looking at this," says Gene Temple, executive director of the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University. It's a lot more common with younger donors who are setting up new foundations. Or donors who are young at heart. Buffett is 76, and he's also overseeing a charitable obligation that's increasing in size. Last June, when Buffett unveiled his plan to give away 85% of his Berkshire shares, the gift was worth $37 billion. Since then, the stock has risen about 15%. Marking to Myth, September 3, 2007, by Warren Buffett. Fortune asked a baker's dozen of financial thinkers to share both their reactions to the tightening credit crisis and their insights about the road ahead. Here are Buffett's comments.
Many institutions that publicly report precise market values for the holdings of CDOs and CMOs are, in truth, reporting fiction. They are marking to model rather than marking to market. The recent meltdown in much of the debt market, moreover, has transformed this process into marking to myth. Because many of these institutions are highly leveraged, the difference between model and market could deliver a huge whack to shareholders' equity. Indeed, for a few institutions, the difference in valuations is the difference between what purports to be robust health and insolvency. For these institutions, pinning down market values would not be difficult. They should simply sell 5% of all the large positions they hold. That kind of sale would establish a true value, though one still higher, no doubt, than would be realized for 100% of an oversized and illiquid holding. In one way, I am sympathetic to the institutional reluctance to face the music. I'd give a lot to mark my weight to model rather than market.
The Oracle's Credit Crisis, March 31, 2008. By Telis Demos.
Warren Buffett may be the world's richest man, but you might have a better credit score. When the Berkshire Hathaway CEO recently checked his credit history, his FICO score in one report was 718, slightly below the U.S. median. "I've been telling my family for years that my credit was sort of shaky," Buffett insists. He's kidding, of course, referring to his self-proclaimed stinginess with his kids. In truth, the score may have been due to an impostor. The report cites 23 missed payments on a $294 loan at an HSBC branch in Nevada, where Buffett says he has never had an account. A 2004 study found that 25% of reports contain serious errors, which is why watchdogs say low scores shouldn't be cause to deny a loan. Fortunately for Buffett, he was able to pay for his last car, a Cadillac DTS, in cash.
What Warren Thinks, April 28, 2008, by Nicholas Varcheva. The tagline on this story read, "With Wall Street in chaos, Fortune naturally went to Omaha looking for wisdom." And, with some twists, that describes the article's origins. Bear Stearns had just collapsed into the arms of J.P. Morgan Chase and the U.S. government, and the economy was shuddering. Fortune's managing editor, Andy Serwer, proposed to me that we seek out Buffett's views about the markets and the economic outlook. Knowing, as Andy himself did, that Buffett resists predicting the direction of stock prices and normally ducks macro questions about the economy, I was dubious about our ability to land that article. I instead suggested a different angle. Buffett's practice of holding Q&A sessions and then lunching with business school students who had trekked to Omaha for the occasion. One of those events was coming up. Why not, I said, have a fortune writer observe and then write about what Buffett told the students? We would be getting, I also argued, a picture of Buffett the teacher, the role for which he has said he would most like to be remembered. The resulting piece turned out to be a mix of Andy's idea and mine. Assigned at the 11th hour to the story, fortune writer Nick Varchaver raced to Omaha and listened in as Buffett spent 4 hours with 150 Wharton School students. Then Buffett, never quite totally keeping his eyes on the road, drove Nick and a fortune photographer back to Berkshire's headquarters for a straight-on interview. Recalling his impressions that day, Nick says he was struck by how freely and informatively Buffett talked to the students, and was amazed at his ability to crystallize issues. Nick also added a reporter's insight. I once spent days interviewing a businessman almost as smart as Buffett, and this guy never exhibited the slightest curiosity about my background or how I got to fortune. But before that car ride with Buffett was over, he had asked me one question after another about myself. You don't see that often among the people we interview. The 150 students that Buffett talked to on that April day were among 2,400 from 31 different schools who visited Berkshire in the 2007-2008 school year. By the 2011-2012 year, Buffett had faced up to the demands on his time and cut back to around 1,450 students. But that left him still devoting one Friday a month to a crowd, 160 students, split among 8 schools, each entitled to 20 slots. Having noted that his past visitors were overwhelmingly male, and having suspected some gender bias, Buffett had by then put in a rule that the contingent from each school must be at least 1/3 female. One of his assistants was meanwhile keeping track of a wait list of more than 200 schools hoping to be chosen in 2012 and 2013. C.L.
With Wall Street in chaos, fortune naturally went to Omaha looking for wisdom. If Berkshire Hathaway's annual meeting, scheduled for May 3 this year, is known as the Woodstock of capitalism, then perhaps this is the equivalent of Bob Dylan playing a private show in his own house. Some 15 times a year, Berkshire CEO Warren Buffett invites a group of business students for an intensive day of learning. The students tour one or two of the company's businesses and then proceed to Berkshire headquarters in downtown Omaha, where Buffett opens the floor to 2 hours of questions and answers. Later, everyone repairs to one of his favorite restaurants where he treats them to lunch and root beer floats. Finally, each student gets the chance to pose for a photo with Buffett. In early April, the mega-billionaire hosted 150 students from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, which Buffett attended, and offered fortune the rare opportunity to sit in as he expounded on everything from the Bear Stearns bailout to the prognosis of the economy to whether he'd rather be CEO of GE or a paperboy. What follows are edited excerpts from his question-and-answer session with the students, his lunchtime chat with the Whartonites over chicken parmigiana at Piccolo Pete's, and an interview with fortune in his office. Buffett began by welcoming the students with an array of Coca-Cola products. Berkshire owns a little over 8% of Coke, so we get the profit on 1 out of 12 cans. I don't care whether you drink it, but just open the cans if you will. He then plunged into weightier matters. Before we start in on questions, I would like to tell you about one thing going on recently. It may have some meaning to you if you're still being taught efficient market theory, which was standard procedure 25 years ago. But we've had a recent illustration of why the theory is misguided. In the past 7 or 8 or 9 weeks, Berkshire has built up a position in auction rate securities, bonds whose interest rates are periodically reset at auction, of about $4 billion. And what we have seen there is really quite phenomenal. Every day we get bid lists. The fascinating thing is that on these bid lists, frequently, the same credit will appear more than once. Here's one from yesterday. We bid on this particular issue. This happens to be Citizens Insurance, which is a creature of the state of Florida. It was set up to take care of hurricane insurance, and it's backed by premium taxes, and if they have a big hurricane and the fund becomes inadequate, they raise the premium taxes. There's nothing wrong with the credit, so we bid on 3 different citizen securities that day. We got one bid at an 11.33% interest rate. One that we didn't buy went for 9.87%, and one went for 6%. It's the same bond, the same time, the same dealer. And a big issue. This is not some little anomaly, as they like to say in academic circles every time they find something that disagrees with their theory. So wild things happen in the markets, and the markets have not gotten more rational over the years. They become more followed. But when people panic, when fear takes over, or when greed takes over, people react just as irrationally as they have in the past. Do you think the U.S. financial markets are losing their competitive edge? And what's the right balance between confidence-inspiring standards and between regulations and the Wild West? Well, I don't think we're losing our edge. I mean, there are costs to Sarbanes-Oxley, some of which are wasted, but they're not huge relative to the $20 trillion in total market value. I think we've got fabulous capital markets in this country, and they get screwed up often enough to make them even more fabulous. I mean, you don't want a capital market that functions perfectly if you're in my business. People continue to do foolish things no matter what regulation is, and they always will. There are significant limits to what regulation can accomplish. As a dramatic illustration, take 2 of the biggest accounting disasters in the past 10 years, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. We're talking billions and billions of dollars of misstatements at both places. Now, these are 2 incredibly important institutions. I mean, they accounted for over 40% of the mortgage flow a few years back. Right now, I think they're up to 70%. They're quasi-governmental in nature, so the government set up an organization called OFHEO. I'm not sure what all the letters stand for. Note to Warren, they stand for Office of Federal Housing Enterprise Oversight. But if you go to OFHEO's website, you'll find that its purpose was to just watch over these 2 companies. OFHEO had 200 employees. Their job was simply to look at 2 companies and say, are these guys behaving like they're supposed to? And, of course, what happened were 2 of the greatest accounting misstatements in history. While these 200 people had their jobs, it's incredible. I mean, 2 for 2? It's very, very, very hard to regulate people. If I were appointed a new regulator, if you gave me 100 of the smartest people you can imagine to work for me, and every day I got the positions from the biggest institutions, all their derivative positions, all their stock positions, and currency positions, I wouldn't be able to tell you how they were doing. It's very, very hard to regulate when you get into very complex instruments where you've got hundreds of counterparties. The counterparty behavior and risk was a big part of why the Treasury and the Fed felt that they had to move in over a weekend at Bear Stearns. And I think they were right to do it, incidentally. Nobody knew what would be unleashed when you had thousands of counterparties with, I read someplace, contracts with a 14 trillion notional value. Those people would have tried to unwind all those contracts if there had been a bankruptcy. What that would have done to the markets, what that would have done to other counterparties in turn, it gets very, very complicated. So regulating is an important part of the system. The efficacy of it is really tough.
At Piccolo Pete's, where he has dined with everyone from Microsoft's Bill Gates to New York Yankees' Alex Rodriguez, Buffett sat at a table with 12 Whartonites and bantered over many topics. How do you feel about the election?
Way before they both filed, I told Hillary that I would support her if she ran, and I told Barack that I would support him if he ran. So I am now a political bigamist. But I feel either would be great. And actually, I feel that if a Republican wins, John McCain would be the one I would prefer. I think we've got three unusually good candidates this time.
They're all moderate in their approach.
Well, the one we don't know for sure about is Barack. On the other hand, he has the chance to be the most transformational, too.
I know you had a paper route. Was that your first job?
Well, I worked for my grandfather, which was really tough in the family grocery store. But if you gave me the choice of being CEO of General Electric or IBM or General Motors, you name it, or delivering papers, I would deliver papers. I would. I enjoyed doing that. I can think about what I want to think. I don't have to do anything I don't want to do. It might be wonderful to be head of GE, and Jeff Immelt is a friend of mine, and he's a great guy. But think of all the things he has to do, whether he wants to do them or not.
How do you get your ideas?
I just read. I read all day. I mean, we put $500 million in PetroChina. All I did was read the annual report. Editor's note, Berkshire purchased the shares 5 years ago and sold them in 2007 for $4 billion.
What advice would you give to someone who is not a professional investor? Where should they put their money?
Well, if they're not going to be an active investor, and very few should try to do that, then they should just stay with index funds, any low-cost indexed fund. And they should buy it over time. They're not going to be able to pick the right price and the right time. And what they want to do is avoid the wrong price and the wrong stock. You just make sure you own a piece of American business and you don't buy all at one time.
When Buffett said he was ready to pose for photographs, all 150 students stampeded out of the room within seconds and formed a massive line. For the next half hour, each one took his or her turn with Buffett, often in hammy poses. Wrestling for his wallet was a favorite. Then, as he started to leave, a 77-year-old's version of A Hard Day's Night ensued, with a pack of 30 students trailing him to his gold Cadillac. Once free, he drove this fortune writer back to his office and continued fielding questions. How does the current turmoil stack up against past crises?
Well, that's hard to say. Everyone has so many variables in it. But there's no question that this time there's extreme leveraging and, in some cases, the extreme prices of residential housing or buyouts. You've got $20 trillion of residential real estate, and you've got $11 trillion of mortgages, and a lot of that does not have a problem, but a lot of it does. In 2006, you had $330 billion of cash taken out in mortgage refinancings in the United States. That's a hell of a lot. I mean, we talk about having $150 billion of stimulus now, but that was $330 billion of stimulus. And that's just from prime mortgages. That's not from subprime mortgages. So leveraging up was one hell of a stimulus for the economy.
If that was one hell of a stimulus, do you think the $150 billion government stimulus plan will make an impact?
Well, it's $150 billion more than we'd have otherwise. But it's not like we haven't had stimulus. And then the simultaneous, more or less, LBO boom, which was called private equity this time. The abuses keep coming back, and the terms got terrible and all that. You've got a banking system that's hung up with lots of that. You've got a mortgage industry that's deleveraging, and it's going to be painful.
The scenario you're describing suggests we're a long way from turning a corner.
I think so. I mean, it seems everybody says it'll be short and shallow, but it looks like it's just the opposite. You know, Deleveraging by its nature takes a lot of time, a lot of pain, and the consequences kind of roll through in different ways. Now, I don't invest a dime based on macro forecasts, so I don't think people should sell stocks because of that. I also don't think they should buy stocks because of that.
Your OFHEO example implies you're not too optimistic about regulation.
Finance has gotten so complex with so much interdependency. I argued with Alan Greenspan some about